Right and wrong. The oldest surviving argument about where those two things actually come from was recorded outside a courthouse in Athens, around the year 399 BCE, and it takes the form of a single question that nobody has ever fully answered. A man named Euthyphro is on his way in to prosecute his own father. He's certain he's doing the right thing, and when Socrates asks him how he knows, Euthyphro gives the answer most people in the ancient world would have given, because it's what the gods want. And Socrates asks him the question that has been sitting in the middle of Western moral philosophy ever since. Do the gods love what's good because it's good, or is it good only because the gods happen to love it? Take a second with that, because it's a fork in the road, and there's no third path. If the first one is true, then goodness is something that exists on its own, and even a god is recognizing it rather than inventing it. If the second one is true, then goodness has no content of its own at all. It's just a list of preferences held by whoever's in charge, and if the list had said something else, that something else would be good. That's the whole investigation today. Not whether the 10 Commandments are wise, a lot of them are. The question is what kind of thing a moral rule is, and whether our sense of right and wrong is something that got handed down to human beings from outside, or something human beings recognized and then wrote down and attributed to heaven. And this is not an abstract question in American life right now. In 2024, Louisiana passed a law requiring a display of the 10 Commandments in every public classroom in the state, from kindergarten through the state universities. It went straight into federal court. A panel of the Fifth Circuit blocked it. Then the full court vacated that ruling in February of 2026, and the whole thing has been moving toward the Supreme Court. So by the time you're watching this, the status may well have changed, and it's worth checking where it landed. Those granite monuments you've seen outside county courthouses have their own history, and it's stranger than you'd guess. Most of them came from the Fraternal Order of Eagles, a fraternal service organization which started distributing 10 Commandments plaques in the late 1940s. The idea came from a juvenile court judge in Minnesota named E.J. Rugemer, who thought kids coming through his courtroom had no moral framework. Then, in 1956, Cecil B. DeMille came out with his movie starring Charlton Heston, and the Eagles and the studio ended up working together. Monuments went up in courthouse squares and state capitol grounds all across the country, partly as a public morality campaign and partly as movie promotion. One of those monuments, placed on the Texas Capitol grounds in 1961, ended up in front of the Supreme Court in 2005 in a case called Van Orden versus Perry, and the court allowed it to stay. On the very same day, in a case out of Kentucky called McCreary County, the court ordered courthouse displays taken down because those had been put up recently and with an obvious religious purpose. Same day, same 9 justices, opposite outcomes. Which tells you the country has never actually settled what those tablets are, a religious text, a legal heritage, or a public statement about where law comes from. So here's where this trail goes. 4 separate bodies of evidence, each of which tells us something about the origin of moral rules, what's inside the 10 Commandments themselves, and what the manuscripts show about how they were counted and translated. The older law codes that were already in circulation when Israel's laws were written, the moral literature of neighboring cultures, which contains a great many of the same commitments, and the internal evidence, the places where the Bible itself has characters arguing with God about right and wrong. Then Kant, and the answer he proposed, which is neither of the two Socrates offered. If this is your kind of hour, subscribing is what keeps these getting made, and hitting like is honestly the entire mechanism by which the next curious person finds this. One more thing before we go into the evidence, and it's a small fact that reframes the topic before we've even started. The phrase, the 10 Commandments, does not appear in the Hebrew text of the passage everyone means by it. In Exodus chapter 20, where the list is given, there's no label on it at all. The Hebrew phrase that later got translated as 10 Commandments, Aseret HaDevarim, which literally means the 10 words, or the 10 statements, shows up in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, and again in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. And in Exodus 34, that phrase is attached to a different list. Go read it. It's about festivals, firstborn animals, unleavened bread, and a rule about not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. The name we use came from Greek and Latin translation, and from church usage centuries later. Jewish tradition still tends to say the 10 statements, which is closer to the Hebrew and, as you'll see, closer to what the text is doing. Now open the two versions side by side, because there are two, and the differences are where the evidence lives. The list appears once in Exodus chapter 20 and again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Most of it matches word for word. Then you get to the Sabbath. In Exodus, the reason given for resting on the seventh day is creation, the way the King James renders it, "In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and rested the seventh day." In Deuteronomy, that reason is gone, completely. What's there instead is this: "Remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out. Therefore, keep the Sabbath." 2 reasons for the same commandment. One cosmic, one historical. One says, rest because the universe was built that way. The other says, rest because you were slaves, and you know what it's like when no one lets you stop. So don't do it to your servants or your animals or the immigrant inside your gates. Historians who work on the composition of these texts, and this is standard in the field, not a fringe reading, take that as evidence of 2 different hands, or at minimum 2 different settings, preserving the same core list with different justifications attached. Neither version says it's quoting the other, and nobody smoothed them out. Both got kept in the same Bible, 3 books apart. The differences don't stop there. In Exodus, coveting your neighbor's house comes first, and the wife is listed after, among the household. In Deuteronomy, the wife is moved to the front and given her own verb, and a field gets added to the list. Small changes, but they're the kind of changes that happen when a text is living inside a community whose sense of things is shifting. Now, the count. You've heard 10 your whole life. Try to actually count them. Go through Exodus chapter 20 and mark where each one starts and stops, and you'll find the text does not number them. The number 10 comes from those later summary verses, but the division into 10 is a decision someone had to make, and different traditions made it differently, and they still do. In Jewish tradition, the first word is the statement that opens the whole thing. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage," which isn't a command at all. It's an introduction, a self-identification, and Jewish counting treats it as the first of the 10. Catholic and Lutheran counting drops that, combines "no other gods" and "no graven images" into a single commandment, and then splits coveting into 2 at the end, one for your neighbor's wife, one for his goods, to get back to 10. Reformed Protestant, Anglican, and Eastern Orthodox counting keeps images as its own separate commandment and leaves coveting as one. So when someone says the 10 commandments, the honest question is, who's 10? A Catholic child and a Presbyterian child memorizing the 4th commandment are memorizing different sentences. That's not a scandal and nobody's hiding it. Any catechism will show you the numbering. It's just a thing almost nobody notices because you only ever learn one version. And it's exactly the problem the Fraternal Order of Eagles ran into when they started putting up monuments. You can't carve the 10 commandments in granite without picking a side. So they had a text drafted with input from Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant clergy, a composite, which means most of those monuments in American courthouse squares display a version of the text that no single tradition actually uses. Then there's translation, and this is the one that shows up in arguments at dinner tables. The 6th commandment, in the King James, is "Thou shalt not kill." In the New International Version and the English Standard Version, it reads, "You shall not murder." Those are not the same claim, and people have built entire ethical positions on the difference: pacifism, capital punishment, war. The Hebrew verb is ratzach. Scholars have gone back and forth on exactly how wide it is. The strong majority position is that it refers to unlawful killing, murder, and in some passages manslaughter, and not to killing in war or judicial execution, because the same body of law prescribes both of those using different verbs. A minority argue the word is broader than that. What's not in dispute is that the King James translators, working in 1611 with the English of their time, chose a word that has drifted since. Anyone who ever sat in a Sunday school class and thought, wait, this says don't kill, but 4 chapters later God is ordering executions. You weren't being difficult. You'd spotted a real translation seam, and it took the field a couple of centuries to sort out what you noticed in one afternoon. Now, the second body of evidence, and this is where the ground shifts. In the winter of 1901 and 1902, a French archaeological expedition led by Jacques de Morgan was digging at Susa, in what's now western Iran. One of his team, Gustave Jacquier, uncovered a pillar of black diorite about 7.5 feet tall, broken into 3 pieces. It had been hauled to Susa as war loot around 1100 BCE, taken from a Babylonian city. Carved into it, in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing pressed into clay and stone across Mesopotamia were 282 laws. It's the Code of Hammurabi, from the reign of a Babylonian king who ruled somewhere around 1790 to 1750 BCE. It's in the Louvre now, standing in a room in Paris where anybody with a ticket can walk right up to it. At the top of the stone, there's a carved scene. Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and the god of justice, who is seated, handing him the symbols of authority. Look at what that image is doing. Roughly 500 years before the earliest dates anyone proposes for Israel's law collections, a king is depicted receiving law from a god. The prologue says he was called by the gods to make justice appear in the land, to keep the strong from oppressing the weak. That framing, law comes down from the divine to the human, was not unusual in the ancient Near East. It was close to standard. It's the normal way a legal collection announced itself. And the parallels get specific enough to raise your eyebrows. Take the goring ox. In Exodus chapter 21, verses 28 through 32, there's a law about an ox that gores someone to death. If the ox had no history of it, the ox is destroyed and the owner isn't liable. If the owner had been warned that the animal was dangerous and did nothing, the owner is liable too. If the victim was a slave, the payment is 30 shekels of silver. Now go to the laws of Hammurabi, sections 250 through 252. Same scenario. Ox gores a man to death. If nobody had warned the owner, no claim. If the owner had been warned and didn't restrain the animal, he pays half a mina of silver, 30 shekels. If the victim was somebody's slave, 20 shekels. Same case, same distinction between a first offense and a known dangerous animal. Nearly the same numbers, and the differences matter just as much as the parallels. In Exodus, the ox itself is stoned and its meat can't be eaten, which treats the animal as having done something, not just as damaged property. And when a free person is killed by a known dangerous ox, Exodus starts from the death of the owner rather than a payment. Moshe Greenberg, who taught at the Hebrew University, argued that this reflects a real difference in how the two systems valued human life, that biblical law resists letting money settle a killing in a way Babylonian law does not. So, what's the relationship? There's a live argument about it. David Wright, at Brandeis, published a book in 2009 arguing that the collection of laws in Exodus known as the Covenant Code is directly dependent on the laws of Hammurabi, that a scribe worked with the Babylonian text in front of him. Other scholars, including Bruce Wells, have pushed back hard, arguing the similarities come from a shared legal culture and shared oral tradition across the region, rather than from one document copying another. That disagreement is unresolved and both sides are serious, but you don't need to resolve it to see the thing that matters here. Whichever way the influence ran, laws about oxen and warnings and liability were circulating through the ancient Near East for centuries before they were written into scripture, being adapted by community after community, and every one of those communities said their version came from a god, which puts Socrates' question in a very concrete setting. If the same rule shows up in Babylon under Shamash, and in Israel under Yahweh, and in a dozen other collections under other names, what's actually doing the work? The divine attribution, or the underlying judgment that a man who knows his ox is dangerous and lets it wander is responsible for what happens next? That covenant framing, a divine sovereign, a bound people, blessings and curses attached, turns out to have its own paper trail in the treaty archives of the ancient Near East, and it's a genuinely wild story. There's a video here on the channel, How the Idea of a Chosen People Actually Developed, that follows that trail from the clay tablets forward, and it's worth walking through after this one if you haven't sat with it yet. For now, stay with the moral content itself, because the third body of evidence is where the pattern really opens up. Egypt. Centuries before Israel's laws were written down, Egyptian funerary texts were already describing a moral examination of the dead. The collection we call the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian title translates closer to the Spells for Going Forth by Day, includes a section catalogued as Spell 125. Copies of it survive from the New Kingdom, from around 1550 BCE onward, on papyrus rolls buried with the dead. What it describes is a courtroom. The dead person enters a hall, and their heart is placed on a scale, weighed against a feather, the feather of Maat, which is the Egyptian word for truth, order, and rightness all in one concept. And before the weighing, the person has to speak. What they recite is a list of 42 denials. Scholars call it the negative confession, or the Declaration of Innocence. Listen to what's on it. I have not committed sin. I have not stolen. I have not killed nor ordered anyone to kill for me. I have not told lies. I have not cheated in the fields. I have not tampered with the scales. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not turned away a stranger. I have not stopped a god in his procession. Some of that is specific to Egyptian religion, and a great deal of it is a moral code you'd recognize from any pulpit in the country. This is where people sometimes brace themselves, expecting to hear that it was all borrowed and none of it is real. That's not the conclusion, and it's not what the evidence supports. What the evidence supports is something more interesting: that human communities separated by deserts and centuries and entirely different pantheons kept arriving at overlapping conclusions about how people ought to treat each other, and each one grounded those conclusions in their own sacred story. The convergence is the finding, not the borrowing, though there is one place where the borrowing is close to visible, and it's in the Bible. In 1888, the British Museum acquired a papyrus, catalogued as Papyrus 10,474. It contains an Egyptian wisdom text called The Instruction of Amenemope, a father's advice to his son, organized into 30 chapters. Wallace Budge published it in 1923. Within a year, the German Egyptologist Adolf Ehrman noticed something. Open Proverbs, chapter 22 at verse 17, where a new section starts, and read through to chapter 24, verse 22. The parallels to Amenemope are close: the warning against moving boundary stones, the advice against befriending a hot-tempered man, the counsel about not wearing yourself out to get rich, the caution about how quickly wealth grows wings and flies away. And then there's Proverbs chapter 22, verse 20. The King James translates it, "Have not I written to thee excellent things?" But the Hebrew there is difficult, and the New International Version renders it, "Have I not written 30 sayings for you?" 30, the number of chapters in Amenemope. Ehrman argued the Hebrew section depends on the Egyptian text. Most scholars today accept some relationship, though the arguing about which direction and how direct has gone on for 100 years. John Ruffle published a well-known challenge to the direct dependence view, and the debate hasn't closed. Either way, sit with what's being said. A body of moral instruction crossed a border, changed languages, changed gods, and ended up in the Bible. Nothing about that was hidden. The Egyptian papyrus has been on public display and in print for a century, and any decent study Bible footnotes the parallel. And the pattern keeps widening. In the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, page 31, there's the story of a man who asks Hillel to teach him the whole Torah while standing on one foot, and Hillel says, "What is hateful to you? Do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary." Around 500 years earlier and 4,000 miles east, a student asks Confucius for one word to live by for a lifetime, and the answer in the Analects is shu, reciprocity. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not want. And in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, the same principle appears in the positive form. 3 traditions with no meaningful contact, landing on the same rule. If a friend of yours has been wondering about this and getting only the shouting versions, send them this one. A calm walk through actual documents is hard to find, and people find things for each other in a way no algorithm manages. Fourth body of evidence, and it's the one that surprised me most when I went looking, because it's inside the text itself. The Bible contains characters who argue with God about right and wrong, and the text does not treat them as blasphemers. Genesis chapter 18. Abraham has been told what's coming for Sodom, and he does not say, "Your will be done." He negotiates. He works God down from 50 righteous people to 45 to 30 to 20 to 10. And in verse 25, in the King James wording, he says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Read that sentence slowly, because of what it assumes. Abraham is holding up a standard of justice and asking whether God is going to meet it. He's not receiving the standard in that moment, he's applying one. Job does something similar at much greater length, and the book ends with God rebuking Job's friends, the ones who defended divine justice with easy answers, and not rebuking Job, who spent 30 chapters demanding an accounting. There's a strand of thought running right through this literature in which the good is something even God is expected to be recognizable by. And that's the first horn of Socrates' fork, showing up inside Scripture itself. Now, the other side deserves a real hearing, because plenty of thoughtful people hold it, and it isn't stupid. The position is usually called divine command theory, That what makes an action wrong is that God forbids it, full stop. And the standard objection is the one Socrates set up. If God had commanded cruelty, would cruelty be good? Most defenders don't accept that framing. Robert Adams, who taught at Yale and then Oxford, developed what's called a modified version, arguing that moral obligation is grounded in the commands of a God whose nature is essentially loving. So the question, what if God commanded cruelty, is asking what would follow if God weren't God. Aquinas made a related move centuries earlier. Goodness isn't a set of rules God chose, and it isn't a standard above God either. It's God's own nature, which doesn't fluctuate. Whether that solves the problem or relocates it is a genuinely open question that philosophers of religion are still working on. If you want to think it through honestly, you have to hold both of those seriously, and neither side gets to wave the other off. But here's what the historical evidence lets us say with more confidence, and it's narrower and sturdier than either position. You've heard the argument in its popular form. Somebody at a Wednesday night study or a college dorm hallway says, if there's no God, what's stopping you from killing whoever you want? It's usually said with real feeling, and it comes from a real place, a sense that the rules need a foundation or they'll collapse. What the record shows is that the foundation and the rules came into contact in a particular order. The prohibitions against killing, stealing, and lying show up in every documented society that left us enough writing to check. With or without the same gods, with or without any resembling ours. What varies wildly is who counts as a full person the rules apply to. That's the actual variable. Not whether murder is wrong, but which killings get classified as murder, and whose life gets counted at full weight. Which is the more disturbing finding, honestly? Every one of those codes says do not kill. Every one of them also has a category of people the rule doesn't fully cover. The enemy, the slave, the foreigner, the outsider. Hammurabi's 20 shekels for a slave versus half a mina for a free man is that exact thing, priced out in silver. So the interesting story of moral history isn't the discovery of the rules. It's the slow, contested, wildly incomplete expansion of who they apply to. And that expansion has almost always been argued for by people using the same texts their opponents were using. That's the pattern. Now the question is what explains it, and this is where Kant enters. Not with a nicer version of either horn, but by refusing the fork. Königsberg, 1785. Kant publishes a short, dense book on the foundations of morality, and in the first section he does something you wouldn't expect from a philosopher with a reputation for coldness. He tells a story about a shopkeeper. Picture a merchant who never overcharges his customers, not even the inexperienced ones who wouldn't know the difference. A child comes in and gets exactly the same price as everyone else. Perfectly honest conduct. And Kant says, we can't yet call this moral, because the merchant has an obvious interest in it. Word gets around. His reputation is his business. He may be doing precisely the right thing entirely because it pays. Then Kant asks the question that reorganizes the whole subject. What would it take for that action to be worth something morally, rather than just being correct? His answer is that the merchant would have to be honest, because honesty is what he owes, whether or not it pays. And Kant's claim is that everybody already understands this. Not philosophers, everybody. An ordinary person can tell the difference between someone who's kind and someone who's performing kindness because they're being watched. You don't need training to see it. Nobody taught you that distinction. You brought it with you. That's his opening wedge, and it drives toward a conclusion that lands square on our fork. Kant's position is that a rule you obey because someone powerful told you to, and because there's a consequence if you don't, isn't a moral rule at all. It's a prudent one. If the only thing standing between you and cruelty is a threat, then you're not being good, you're being careful. And a person being careful will stop the moment the watcher leaves the room. He has terms for this. When the source of a rule is outside you, an authority, a reward, a punishment, a custom, he calls that heteronomy, which means being governed from elsewhere. When you're the one who gives yourself the law, because you've recognized it as binding, he calls that autonomy, self-legislation. And that's his answer to Socrates. Not, the gods invented it. Not, there's a standard floating out there in the universe that everyone, including God, consults. His answer is that the moral law is what any reasoning being would give itself, that you don't find it in a book or a stone tablet or a scale in an Egyptian hall, because it's already the thing that lets you recognize the tablet as containing something worth keeping. The test he proposed is famous and usually gets garbled, so let's put it in plain terms. He asks, could the rule you're acting on be a rule that everybody follows without the whole thing falling apart? Try it with lying to get out of trouble. If everybody did it, statements would carry no weight, and the lie wouldn't even work. The practice destroys itself if it's made universal. That's the structure he's pointing at. And he gave a second version of the test that's easier to feel. Act, he says, so that you treat humanity, in yourself and in anybody else, always as an end, and never merely as a means. Which is not a rule against using people. You use people constantly. You used the cashier this morning. It's a rule against treating a person as only that, as a tool, a resource, a means to your ends and nothing more. Now, run that formula back over everything we just looked at. The variable across every ancient code wasn't whether killing was wrong, it was who counted. And Kant's formula is precisely a claim about who counts. Anybody who reasons, anybody who can recognize a law and hold themselves to it, has the same standing you do. Not because they're valuable to you, not because of their nation or their status or their price in silver. He puts it as a contrast. Things have a price and can be exchanged for something equivalent, but a person has dignity, which means no equivalent exists. Whether or not Kant himself lived up to the full reach of that principle, and in places he plainly did not, as his own critics have documented, the principle got loose. It's in the language of human rights. It's the reason he was only property stopped being an acceptable sentence in a courtroom. So is he right? That's a fair question to ask a 240-year-old argument, and there's evidence to bring to it now that he never had. At Yale, in 2007, Kylie Hamlin, Karen Wynn, and Paul Bloom published a study in the journal Nature using a puppet show. Babies watched a wooden shape struggling to climb a hill. In one scene, a second shape came along and pushed it up. In another, a different shape shoved it back down. Then the babies were offered both characters. 6-month-olds and 10-month-olds overwhelmingly reached for the helper. Later work in the same lab reported similar preferences in infants as young as 3 months, measured by where they looked. Now, honesty about the science, because this field has had a rough decade. A team in New Zealand led by Damien Scarf published a challenge in 2012, arguing the babies might be responding to perceptual features of the display rather than to anything social. And infant research generally has been through a serious reckoning about replication and small sample sizes. So this is suggestive, not settled, and anyone who tells you babies have been proven to have morals is going further than the data goes. What it does support is the narrower claim, and the narrower claim is the one that matters here. Something about social evaluation is running in human beings very early, before language, before instruction, before anybody hands a child a rule. Kant would not have been surprised, though he'd have insisted the moral law itself is a matter of reason rather than a preference you can measure with a puppet. Then step up from the lab to the largest scale we have and watch the same thing happen in public. November 21st, 1945, Nuremberg. Robert Jackson, an American Supreme Court justice serving as chief prosecutor, opens the case against the surviving Nazi leadership. And he faces an argument the defense keeps making in various forms, that these men followed the laws of their own state, that what they did was legal where they did it, and that no written international statute forbade it in advance. The tribunal's answer, built into its charter, was that following orders is not a defense, and that acting for a state does not shield you. Which is a court saying, out loud, that there's a standard that written law can be measured against and found wanting. Legal scholars still argue about what that ruling rested on, whether it was natural law reasoning or existing treaty obligations or something improvised under enormous pressure. That debate is real. What isn't in question is that the 20th century's most consequential trial ran on the assumption that a person is capable of recognizing an order as monstrous, regardless of who issued it. And now the window opens wider, because this fork isn't a Western argument or a Christian one. Islamic theology had this exact debate for centuries and gave it names. The Mutazilite school held that good and evil are knowable by reason, and that God commands what is good because it is good. The Asharite school held the other horn, that what is good is what God commands, and that human reason has no independent standing to judge. That argument ran for generations and shaped Islamic law and philosophy. Hindu thinkers in the Mimamsa tradition worked through a version of it about the authority of ritual duty. Chinese philosophy had the mohists arguing for a standard of universal care against critics who grounded obligation in relationship and role. Every literate tradition that has thought hard about obligation has found this fork, which is itself evidence about what kind of question it is. If that connection just landed for you, if the Louisiana courtroom and the Egyptian scale and the Nuremberg dock suddenly look like one continuous argument, the like button is what carries this to the next person who's been circling the same question without a place to put it. Here's what usually lifts for people who follow this all the way down. The fear underneath the whole subject is that moral rules are like a building on a foundation, and that examining the foundation is the same as taking a jackhammer to it. If the commandments turn out to have neighbors in Babylon, and the Sabbath has 2 different reasons attached, and the count of 10 is an editorial decision, and Egyptian scribes were writing, "I have not taken milk from the mouths of children," 1,000 years earlier, then it all comes down, and the only thing left is whatever you can get away with. The evidence points the other direction, and it does so pretty hard. If moral rules were arbitrary, invented by one group, imposed by force, propped up by a threat, you'd expect them to look completely different everywhere. They don't. You find the same short list of commitments recurring in societies with nothing else in common. Don't kill members of your community. Don't steal from them. Don't lie in ways that destroy trust. Care for the ones who can't protect themselves. Keep your word. Written in cuneiform, in hieroglyphs, in Hebrew, in Chinese, under gods who share nothing but the job. That's not what a fabrication looks like. That's what a discovery looks like, made independently, over and over, by people who kept running into the same facts about what it takes for humans to live near each other. And the weight that comes off is a specific one. You do not have to establish the historical pedigree of a moral claim before you're allowed to act on it. You never did. When you look at cruelty and recognize it as cruelty, that recognition isn't waiting on an archaeologist. It's the equipment you were using to evaluate the archaeologist's findings in the first place. That's Kant's real contribution, and it's easy to miss because he's remembered as the man of rules. His claim was that you are not a receiver of moral rules. You are a source of them, that the capacity to recognize an obligation and hold yourself to it, without a threat and without an audience, is what makes you the kind of thing that can't be priced. Not your usefulness, not your obedience, not your membership in the right group. At the end of one of his major works, he wrote about the 2 things that filled him with steadily increasing awe the more he thought about them: the starry heavens above him and the moral law within him. That line is on a plaque near his grave in Kaliningrad, which is what Königsberg is called now. And notice what he's actually saying. Both of those are wonders, not the rule book and not obedience. The night sky, and the strange fact that a human being carries something inside that issues commands to them and asks nothing in return. He's not without critics, and they're worth knowing. He wrote an essay in 1797 arguing you may not lie even to a murderer at the door looking for your friend, which most readers find indefensible and which Benjamin Constant attacked at the time. Carol Gilligan and others have argued that a morality built on universal rules undervalues care, particularity, and relationship, the moral work most people actually do all day. Those objections are serious, and Kant does not survive all of them intact. But the piece that holds is the one that changes how the whole trail reads. Everything we looked at today, the 2 Sabbath rationales, the shared law about the goring ox, the 42 denials on the Egyptian papyrus, the arguing with God at Sodom, the courthouse monument with a composite text nobody's church actually uses, none of it works as evidence that morality is a fiction. All of it works as evidence that human beings have been circling the same territory for 4,000 years and keep sending back similar maps. The curiosity that got you this far is exactly the equipment we've been talking about. The kid who read "Thou shalt not kill" and then read the next few chapters and went quiet, that kid was doing moral reasoning correctly, using the tool Kant is describing. The person who noticed their Catholic cousin's 4th commandment was a different sentence than theirs was reading carefully, which is the only honest way to read anything. And the adult who has been quietly afraid that pulling this thread would leave them with nothing, the record says the opposite. Pull it, and what you find is company. 4,000 years of it. If you want the piece of this that runs underneath the legal side, how the covenant framework itself was borrowed from the treaty language of empires, and what that did to a whole people's self-understanding, the video here on the channel called "How the Idea of a Chosen People Actually Developed" follows that trail with the same care, and it's a good next hour if you haven't watched it. There's a lot of ground still to cover, and subscribing is what makes the next one possible. And if somebody you know has been carrying these questions on their own, pass this along. Then tell me something in the comments. What's a moral rule you were taught as a child that you still keep, not because you were told to, but because you looked at it as an adult and decided it was right? And is there one you were taught and quietly set down? The commandments were carved into stone because stone lasts. But the reason anybody recognized them as worth carving was never in the stone. It was in the person doing the reading.